Good evening and welcome to the 2022 Sokolof Lecture of the Schwab Center for Israel and Jewish Studies, located here at the University of Nebraska, Omaha. I'm so pleased to welcome all of you tonight to our very exciting Sokolof Lecture this year. For those of you who are new to the Schwab Center, it was formed 11 years ago, and the purpose of the Nathan and Hannah Schwab Center is to create, coordinate, and promote interdisciplinary programming, scholarship, and teaching to expand knowledge about Israel and Judaism on the university campus and beyond. I'm Jeanette Gabriel. I'm the director of the Schwab Center for Israel and Jewish Studies, and we fulfill our mission through programming all year long. You can look at our website to see our spring programming. We feature arts projects, bring in speakers from Israel and throughout the world, and of course, support emerging scholarship from students and faculty scholarship here at the University of Nebraska, Omaha. Tonight, I'm very pleased to extend a welcome to you on behalf of the Sokolof family who have supported this lectureship through the Schwab Center for Israel and Jewish Studies. And tonight, Gary Javits will be saying a few words of welcome on behalf of the Sokolof family.
Thank you, Jeanette, and welcome everyone to the 2022 Ruth and Phil Sokolof lecture featuring Eugene Kontorovich. And I hope I pronounced that correctly. All right. Two things. First, a few brief words about Ruth and Phil, for whom this lecture is named. Phil Sokolof, who had only a high school education, was worldly enough to launch, almost from scratch, a multi-million-dollar business from which he gave a high percentage of his profits to charity. Ruth Sokolof, a teacher of blind and visually impaired children, stricken with cancer at age 26, devoted the remaining 26 years of her life to helping young people. Both valued their family, helping the Jewish people, help America, and educating youngsters. So I appreciate very much the Schwab Center's guest, Mr. Kontorovich. Over many years, I have learned and enjoyed his very informative, extremely insightful, and always well-balanced articles about Israel and the many world challenges they have faced in their 74-year history. I am so glad that we could share him with all of you tonight. You're in for a treat. Please welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Gary. Before turning to Professor Kontorovich, I'd like to just mention a few ground rules for the evening. This is a webinar due to the high number of people who are participating. There will be a very short, we'll try to get in as many questions as we can at the end of the lecture. Please feel free to put your questions in, submit your questions, and we'll see as many as we can get to. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our 2022 Sokolof lecture. Professor Eugene Kontorovich is one of the world's preeminent experts on universal jurisdiction and maritime piracy, as well as international law and the Israel-Arab conflict. He is the director of the Scalia Law School Center for the Middle East and International Law. He joined the Scalia Law School from Northwestern University Pritzker School of Law, where he was professor of law from 2011 to 2018, and an associate professor from 2007 to 2011. Previously, he was a visiting professor at the University of Chicago from 2005 to 2007, and assistant professor at George Mason School of Law from 2003 to 2007. He's published over 30 major scholarly articles and book chapters in leading law reviews and peer-reviewed journals in the United States and Europe, including the American Journal of International Law, the International Review of Law and Economics, Stanford Law Review, California Law Review, University of Pennsylvania Law Review, and Virginia Law Review. His scholarship has been cited by appellate courts in the US and around the world. His expertise is often sought out and quoted by major news organizations, such as the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, NPR News, The New Yorker, Los Angeles Times, and numerous television and radio programs. His popular writings, in addition to all of his scholarly work, have appeared in the New York Times, Wall Street Journals, Los Angeles Times, Politico, Commentary, Haaretz, and numerous other leading publications. Perhaps many of you have seen his frequent contributions to the Wall Street Journal's editorial pages. So without further ado, I would like to hand over the lecture to Professor Kontorovich.
Thank you so much, Dr. Gabriel. Thank you so much to the Schwab Center and the Sokolof family for hosting this lecture. It's my honor to be here with all of you tonight. I wish it were in person, hopefully some other time, to discuss a heavy topic about modern blood libels. And let me preface this. I'm saying criticisms of Israel are increasingly made using terms of international law. Criticisms of Israel is criticized, accused of extraordinary, horrible things, using the rhetoric and language of international law. We're going to talk about why that's the case. So these are legal claims. Right? Apartheid is a legal claim. Other claims we're going to explore are legal claims. And the question is, are these very significant criticisms or allegations about Israel? Are they anti-Semitic? Are they true? Are they wrong? Are they anti-Semitic? And so I think it's very hard to enter into a discussion of the nature of such allegations based on people's motives, because we don't really know what motivates people to do things or say things. But what I want to explore in this lecture is by exploring some of the current claims made against Israel, claims that have a legal basis, that are essentially legal claims, and by demonstrating how unfounded those claims are. I think unfounded is not really the word. How unconnected with the truth those claims are. We will see that these claims have a structural resemblance. They have a common morphology, right? That with the most classic anti-Semitic accusations in history, with things like medieval blood libels. And so let me set the stage by talking very briefly about medieval blood libels and examining maybe their structure and why they were made. And then we will look to some contemporary discussions of Israel and see if maybe there is a common structure. Okay, I will speak louder, as I saw somebody said in the chat. So what is a blood libel? A blood libel is a fairly extraordinary claim that Jews use the blood of Christian babies in the production of their matzah. Now, that claim may seem counterintuitive, to say the least, to many of you, but this was a regular, repeated claim against Jews throughout the Middle Ages, which was not merely made in some kind of fringe setting, but led to pogroms against Jewish communities over and over again. Indeed, even just 100 years ago, there was a trial in Imperial Russia of Mendel Belis, who was accused in a criminal proceeding, literally, of abducting and murdering a Christian child and using their blood to make Passover matzah. Okay, so as an anti-Semitic, so this is a regular, repeated anti-Semitic accusation, which had great impact historically, and really people believed it, and it spurred them to action against the Jews. Yeah, so ask yourself this question. If you were an anti-Semite, would you bother with blood libel, with accusing Jews of using Christian babies' blood? Would this be something you say? If I, so I think, God forbid, but if I was an anti-Semite, wouldn't it be better to just say things like Jews control the banks because there are in fact Jews who own banks? So that's like partially true. So most lies, this is the key feature that I'm trying to point out here, most lies have some area that is true, and then they add parts that are false. That is the characteristic of a lie, has aspects of truth, and then falsehood is intermingled, and that makes the lie go over better. Right? The blood libel is not like a typical lie that takes parts of the truth and takes it too far. It does not intersect with the truth in any way, right? Because of course, what's extraordinary about the blood libel, they take something about which Jews tend to be, about which Jews are the most careful. Jews are the most careful. Passover, right? Passover is the thing Jews are most careful about. Even Jews who are generally not ritually careful are going to be careful about Passover. So they say this thing that Jews are most careful about, to have it kosher. Not only is it not kosher, it's used with blood. The thing that Jews are most particular about. What else are Jews particular about? Blood. Not drinking blood, but a basic fundamental Jewish thing. Even people who generally don't keep kosher are not drinking blood. Not to mention, we're not even talking about gebrochts or other complicated ritual issues. The last place you're going to have blood, let alone of babies, is going to be of matzah. And so it's not just not the truth, it's the opposite and the distortion. It's not just the distortion, pardon, it's the inversion of the truth. So why would someone make a inversion of the truth, which a lie that is much bigger would seem to be harder to sell? But at the same time, I think there's two major features that the blood libel managed to accomplish. So first of all, when you have a lie that is not even intersecting with the truth in any way, right? It's not like there's not only is there not Christian babies' blood in matzah, there's no other kind of blood, and there's no other kind of blood in any kind of Jewish food. When you have no intersection with the truth, it's harder to refute the claim using the truth, because a lie that is based on truth intersects with reality, which gives you a kind of leverage or purchase to begin to push back on it. A lie that is disjointed from reality, not the case. But also, I think, so that's another important feature of the blood libel, is it resonated with what mattered to people most, with the anxieties and strongest feelings of the day. Of course, in the Middle Ages, Europe had a devout Christian population. And when you say blood libel, when you say matzah and Christian blood, the allusion, which nobody would have missed, would be immediately to the Last Supper and the blood of Christ. And this is something that would inflame people. So the point with the blood libel, the point is not just to convince, but to play on emotions, to play on the strongest emotions and the most sensitive issues in a way that even if you're not convincing, you're going to be inciting. Okay, so that's history. Let's now turn to some current claims that are made about Israel. Now, the first one is something that was pushed very, very intensely a bit over a year ago, and has now died down as circumstances have changed. But I think it's very important to recall, because I think it's a perfect case study in legally based defamations of Israel. So in January 2021, the most important thing going on in the world, the thing everybody cared most about, the most sensitive, the most sensational issue, of course, was COVID and the imminent arrival of a vaccine for it. This was the issue that was the issue in the world that everybody cared the most about. And a claim started to be made, and it was first made by some fringe groups, by some fringe NGOs. Then it was adopted by larger NGOs, Israeli NGOs, Western NGOs, and eventually made in the Senate of the United States and the House of the United States by American congressmen, that Israel, in violation of its obligations under international law, is denying or keeping or not providing COVID vaccine to the Palestinians. So why did this happen in January 2021? As soon as it became clear that Israel was going to be a world leader in obtaining the vaccine and providing it to its population, which was seen as an accomplishment, there was an effort to turn that accomplishment into not a failure, a moral failure, a failure of not providing this vaccine for Palestinians as would be required. And the claim was made that Israel is obligated under international law. And this was a claim, again, made by Senator Sanders, other people in Congress, people made in European parliaments, that international law requires Israel to vaccinate. And what I like about this particular case study is, international law is a big subject. Usually when people argue about make claims about Israel and international law, you have to know a fair amount of international law just to begin to respond. But here, the materials are pretty simple and direct. Israel's relationship with the Palestinian Authority is governed by the Oslo Accords, right? A series of agreements signed in 1993 and 1995 between Israel and the Palestinian Authority. These agreements created the Palestinian Authority and gave it jurisdiction over Gaza and much of the West Bank. So it put most of the Palestinian population under the jurisdiction of the Palestinian Authority. And in this agreement, which is very, very long, this is just a very small part of it, I'm just scrolling through on the screen, it talks about what areas the Palestinian Authority, what functions the Palestinian Authority would be responsible for, and what functions Israel would be responsible for. And it talks about agriculture and fisheries and forests, all sorts of things. And there's a section that is specifically on the subject of health. And that section, let's read it. It's an exact denial of this claim. Again, this claim now has died down because now there's not such a anxiety. Is everybody going to get the vaccination? Now the anxiety, some people don't want the vaccination. But when there was a concern of shortage, this was the worst thing you could say about Israel, that someone was not going to get the vaccination because of them. But look who's responsible. It says the powers and responsibilities in the sphere of health in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip will be transferred to the Palestinians. So what do we see here? Israel has nothing to do with the vaccination of the Palestinians. It is, in fact, the Palestinian government that is responsible for their vaccination. So this claim is not true. Okay. The people making this claim, then, faced with the Oslo Accords, have to say, and they did say, you know what? We don't believe in the Oslo Accords. Forget the Oslo Accords. They weren't fair. It's not, the Oslo Accords are only acceptable to the extent that they obligate Israel, not to the extent that they get Israel off the hook. Again, I think this is not a serious reading of the Oslo Accords, which are generally govern or the basis for relations with the Palestinians. But let's say that we can just magically ignore the Oslo Accords in addressing this claim that Israel is responsible for is mismanaging the health of the Palestinians. So the argument then became the West Bank is occupied by Israel, and Israel as an occupying power has to provide for vaccines for the Palestinians. And here the argument was, again, it was a legal argument, that Israel, the West Bank is occupied. Now, I would argue that it is not, in fact, occupied, but let's assume for the sake of argument that the West Bank is occupied, and nonetheless that the Oslo Accords don't exist. So Article 56 of the Geneva Convention, which deals with situations of occupation, talks about hygiene and public health. So they say, look, Israel is responsible for vaccinating the Palestinians. So now let's look at the International Committee for the Red Cross official commentary on this provision about hygiene and public health. What does it say? And again, this is not like some secret text. This is the official explanation of Article 56. It says, there can be no question of making the occupying power alone responsible for taking measures to control epidemics. The task is above all one for the competent services of the occupied country itself. In other words, exactly what the Oslo Accord says, is not Israel's responsibility, it's not Israel's job. Indeed, in situations where it would be an occupying power's job, by the way, it goes on to point out that the occupying power can charge and basically like take money from the unoccupied people to pay for the medical care that they receive. No one was suggesting that, because no one was seriously talking about applying this provision. So, okay, first of all, maybe it's not occupied. Even if it is, you have the Oslo Accords, which says the Palestinian responsibility. The Geneva Conventions say it's not Israel's responsibility. But even if it didn't say that it's not Israel's responsibility, even if Article 56 somehow made it Israel's responsibility, take a look at this next provision. And it's very rare that that international law has such specific provisions that you can show that a claim is so false, like with just specific, clear textual provisions. Article 6 talks about when the Geneva Convention applies, because the Geneva Convention is not the 10 Commandments. It's not like a law for all time. It's a law dealing with situations of war and occupation. And so that's when you read it. You read it in situations of war and occupation. And look what it says. In the case of occupied territory, which again, the critics argue that the West Bank is, the application of the present convention shall cease 1 year after the general close of military operations. When would that be in our case? Oh, it's so hard not to see faces. 1968. It would be 1968. Right? So you don't read these things forever. These are things to do with war and the period shortly after. Now note, the Geneva Convention goes on to mention certain provisions which apply for longer than 1 year. They maybe apply indefinitely, and guess what? The provision about public health is not one of them, because there is no ongoing obligation to provide for public health in a territory that has a functioning public health service. So, what's wrong with this claim? First of all, the Oslo Accords makes this the Palestinian responsibility. Even if the Oslo Accords doesn't apply, and even if the territory is occupied, Article 56 does not say that Israel is in fact, that Israel is responsible to provide vaccinations. It says that it's actually the job of the Palestinians. And even if it didn't say it was the job of the Palestinians, it wouldn't still have any application whatsoever after 1968. Other than that, the claim that Israel was withholding vaccines from the Palestinians is largely true. What do I mean? Of course, it's entirely true and demonstrably true, but yet this was a claim that was made by some of the major human rights organizations and made it into the halls of Congress and European parliaments. Why would someone make such an easily refutable claim? So first of all, I think it's very important to see this case study just to learn the very powerful lesson. Not everything an international organization says is a violation of international law actually is, and please look at the actual provisions of law. So why make such a claim? the point is not to convince people in the long run. Right? The point is, first of all, to touch on the sensitive nerves of society, right? Which are no longer, let's say, Christological, but rather about what bothers people today, which of course was in 2021 COVID. But look even more how. So this is a false claim against Israel, and in its structure, it resonates eerily, like they couldn't help themselves almost, eerily with the most classic anti-Semitic accusations. Of course, one of the most classic anti-Semitic accusations throughout history, leading to pogroms in the Middle Ages, was, other than the blood libel, the claim that Jews are responsible for the spread of disease. Whenever there was an outbreak of plague in Europe, there would be accusations that Jews are the vectors of disease. Jews are the responsible for disease amongst non-Jewish populations. And that, of course, was exactly the claim here, that the Palestinians suffering from COVID, Jews are responsible for. I'm going to stop my sharing. There we go. Thank you, Jeanette. But there'll be more sharing, perhaps, momentarily. Okay, so we see that it has the, like blood libels and other classic anti-Semitic accusations, it's not just not true, it's the inversion of the truth, but has this inflammatory effect. Okay, and now let's turn very briefly. We'll deal more shortly with another subject, and then we will turn to the topic of apartheid, perhaps the most hot button topic, and then we will have time for questions. One of the claims made against Israel currently is that it is responsible for the eviction, the dispossession of Palestinians from their homes, and a dispute that is focused, discussion that is focused on the Jerusalem neighborhood of Sheikh Jarrah, which, if you know, Jerusalem is near the American Colony Hotel, is very close to Route 1 as it goes through Jerusalem. About couple hundred meters from the armistice line of 1948 that went through the middle of the city. So the claim is that Israel is kicking out, dispossessing, evicting Palestinian families from their homes. What is the actual situation? The actual situation, which is not actually in significant dispute and has been has been found to be such by Israeli courts in case or after case, is that the relevant situation, the situation is one as follows. There were properties in this neighborhood. Jews lived in this neighborhood before 1948. In 1948, all of the Jews, of course, in eastern Jerusalem, in the area of Jerusalem that fell under Israeli control, were evicted, or not just evicted, were ethnically cleansed by the Jordanians. Guys, you can hold off with the Q&A because it keeps popping up on my screen. It's a little distracting. When we get to questions, type in your questions. But we have some time. So Jordan ethnically cleansed all of the Jews from the areas of Jerusalem that came under its control. And then when Israel retook those areas in 1967 and put them back under Israeli authority, Jews who owned properties there sought to assert their title. So the properties in question are properties that are owned by Jews, not from before 1948, and where Palestinian families have been living without legal title since 1949. That's beyond dispute. The Jews, in fact, have title. The Palestinians do not have title. How did the Palestinians wind up there? So when Jordan took over in 1949 and kicked all the Jews out, it let, in some cases, it let people move into the Jews' homes. Why not? Why just have them stand empty? So in many, many cases, in most situations, the Jordanians would actually take the Jewish property and give it, or purport to give it, to transfer title to other people, to Palestinians. So they said, this Jewish home, now it belongs to you, and they would record it in the Jordanian property registry. When Israel retook this land in 1967, the land that Jordan gave to, or purported to give, or transferred to Palestinians, was not disturbed. That is to say, Israel said, look, it's not your fault that Jordan gave you this land and you took it and you're now, you made yourself the owner of this Jewish property. Of course, you're just someone living under Jordanian rule. You thought Jordan was going to rule it forever, so if they're giving it out to you, it's not your job to try to be fair. You took this property because the country running the area gave it to you, so you have a basis to believe in the validity of your title. We're not going to kick you out, even though Jordan basically stole this or took this or appropriated this from Jewish owners. However, if Jordan didn't give you title, if you're living there without title, then you're not an owner, and you shouldn't think that you own it. So this is the case with the properties in question, that these are people to whom Jordan did not transfer title. So they have been squatting there for decades, and the owners of the property have been seeking to evict them for now 40 years of court cases. So the owners are Jewish. The people who are staying there, who are not the owners, are Palestinian Arabs. Everybody agrees the following: that if the plaintiffs, the people seeking the restitution of the property, were Arabs, there would be no controversy here, right? That is to say, Arabs sue Arabs all the time in property disputes in this exact same area. But the only reason there is a controversy here is because the plaintiffs are Jews. That is to say, the principle here is that Jews should not be able to exercise property rights in these areas. So not only, let's summarize, not only is this not a situation in which Israel is evicting Palestinians from their homes. They're not Palestinian homes. Israel is not evicting them. These are private property lawsuits being adjudicated in the courts by private parties. So again, it's the opposite of the truth. And the irony, and we're going to see this now as we move on to our next theme, the demand that Jews not have property rights in Jerusalem and that certain neighborhoods be kept completely free of Jews, that's considered a claim of human rights. Or Israel, or to put it differently, Israel allowing Jews to exercise property rights in a neighborhood with a mixed demographic, that's considered bad. But maintaining an area free of Jews, right, that's considered okay. So the apartheid is having a mixed neighborhood and having a all Palestinian neighborhood, that's okay. So let's now turn to the topic of apartheid. Apartheid is a major accusation against Israel. As you know, we're going to hear it over and over. It's been made by various human rights organizations in a highly coordinated way, because the United Nations Human Rights Commission is currently poised to issue a report, which will also say that Israel is an apartheid state. So this is a very serious accusation of what is a serious international crime. So the question is, hold on one second. I need to pause. Hi, and welcome back to the continuation of our session on modern blood libels. Please forgive the interruption, which was due to circumstances beyond my control and the premature closing of the building. Let's resume by turning our attention to perhaps the greatest modern blood libel today, the accusation that Israel is an apartheid state. Now, the accusation is not altogether new in that it resembles very much, if one thinks about it, the classic 1975 accusation by the General Assembly of the United Nations that Zionism, the idea that there should be a form of that should be a Jewish state, is a form of racism. Now, that embarrassingly false declaration was actually rescinded by the United Nations General Assembly in the 90s after it became almost a byword for the bias, anti-Israel, anti-Semitic bias of the United Nations. So that was Zionism equals racism. This is Israel equals apartheid. They're not necessarily such different ideas. Really, the apartheid accusation is the old Zionism equals racism accusation, updated into a somewhat more modern language. But let's consider the apartheid accusation, which again is a blood libel in that it is a lie so big one struggles to gain purchase on it in reality in order to refute it. It's so big one doesn't really know where to start. So first of all, what is apartheid? Apartheid is the system of racial separation practiced by South Africa from 1948 until the end of the apartheid regime in the 90s. Apartheid involved was a series of laws passed by South Africa, which created the complete separation between races in all public spaces. It was Jim Crow on steroids, you might say. Not just all separate public facilities, indeed entire separate residential districts and townships. Blacks were herded into Bantustan districts, politically disenfranchised, could not marry whites, could not travel freely, and were basically denied all civil privileges. And the word apartheid focuses the name the South Africans invented for it. They were not hiding it. This was not a covert feature. This was not like some kind of systemic racism. This was an open and declared policy of the government pursued consistently through pieces of legislation focused on the apartness of peoples. And the policy was fairly distinctive to South Africa. And while there were similar policies in other countries, Rhodesia, for example, none won the label of apartheid. And indeed, since then, despite racially discriminatory policies, indeed maybe even quasi-genocidal policies in countries like China, no other country's policy has won the term apartheid. Countries like Lebanon, where Palestinians are fundamentally disenfranchised for generations, are not considered apartheid states. The crime is so extraordinary and so specific that the internet has not been interpreted. International law has not interpreted this crime. It's a crime because there have been some treaties, including the International Criminal Court Treaty, codifying it as a crime. This crime, no one has been found guilty in the court of international opinion, other than the inventor of this term, the Republic of South Africa. So now comes this campaign to describe Israel as an apartheid state. Now, of course, one can say the obvious points, such as Arabs have full political rights in Israel. They vote. They are represented in the government. They're not just represented in the government. Now they actually hold the keys of power in the government, something blacks never did in the apartheid era, not even remotely. Indeed, a Muslim Brotherhood party currently controls is the decisive votes in the Israeli Knesset. I believe the only country in the Middle East with a Muslim Brotherhood Party in the majority government rather than in the opposition. Arabs are in the Supreme Court, they're officers in the military, and there is no place that is free that is reserved for Jews. That's a fact. All holy places are open to all Jewish holy places are open to all religions. Arabs are free to live in Jewish towns. You can't have a Jewish-only town. Indeed, in a bit of a paradox, the Supreme Court of Israel has held that towns with a Jewish majority, or a primarily Jewish character, cannot block Arabs from buying land there. On the other hand, towns with a majority Arab population can block Jews to preserve their special character. So if anything, there's a discrimination against Jews. Arabs are not drafted to fight in Israel's wars, as blacks were in South Africa. They can volunteer, but they're under no obligation. And even in the West Bank and Judea and Samaria, the public places are open to Jews and Arabs. You can see Jews and Arabs sitting and drinking in cafes, in cities, in Judea and Samaria. There's no requirement to be Jewish to live there. And while few Arabs choose to live there because of the penalties they would face from their own regime, in fact, there are examples who generally choose not to advertise it. So in short, there is none of this apartness in all areas under Israeli rule, all areas under Israeli control. You have both Jews and Arabs. Jews and Arabs can live, Jews and Arabs can work. What's interesting about the apartheid accusation is that it's not that far off, actually. To tell you the truth, it's not that far off. Because if you shift your focus just a few hundred meters from Israel and the territories under its control to the territories under the control of the Palestinian Authority, Gaza, area A and B of the West Bank, the 90% of the city of Hebron, there you see something that is in fact has a bit of a flavor of apartheid. In the areas under the control of the Palestinian Authority, you see Jews are not allowed to live. Jews are not allowed to buy property. You're not allowed to engage in property transactions with them. And indeed, these areas are free from Jews. Jews are unable to live there, not because they wouldn't want to, but because the government has policies that make it impossible for them to do so. Policies like not allowing Jews to own or possess property. Policies, of course, like the pay for slay law that the Palestinian Authority has enacted, which pays people for the extrajudicial execution of Jews. And the more you kill, the more you get paid. So basically, the Palestinian Authority doesn't let Jews have land, pays for death squads and assassinations of Jews, does not allow Jews to worship in public places. There's a list of about a dozen Jewish holy sites that the Palestinian Authority acknowledges as Jewish holy sites in the Oslo agreements, which the Palestinian Authority actually promised to allow Jews access to. In fact, Jews have no free access to these sites, and at best have to sneak in the middle of the night under armed guard, unlike, for example, the Western Wall, where Arabs or Muslims or people of any faith or religion are free to come. So Jewish holy sites are off limits to Jews. And in fact, the entire area under Palestinian control is a perfect form of apartheid, where the Arab majority has completely separated the Jewish population and prevented any Jews from living there. Of course, this is supported by the demonization of Jews in Palestinian educational curriculums. So we see now, coming back to the primary theme, we see that this has the main characteristics we identified of a blood libel. It's not just false, but it's the opposite of the truth, right? That is to say, not only is Israel the most inclusive democratic state in the Middle East, in which there's no apartheid, in which there's no separation or denying of national rights based on ethnicity in any case. Not only that, it's right next door in the Palestinian Authority, you have something that does look like apartheid. You have the clearly racially explicit policies of ethnic discrimination that Israel is being accused of. So it's not just not true, it's not just an opposite of the truth, it's the inversion of the truth. So one doesn't even know where to begin. Though I think it's important to begin to talk about the policies of the Palestinian Authority, because when, if one says, Israel has Arab judges, Israel has Arab legislatures, it's a little bit like answering the classic blood libel by saying, no, our matzahs OU certified, for sure it's without blood. It takes the accusation with greater seriousness than it deserves. But it has this aspect of being an inversion of the truth. And again, why was the blood libel made? Why make such an extraordinary claim, which is clearly going to cost you plausibility to many people? And of course, the obvious answer is what you lose in plausibility, you make up for in inflammability, in exciting people and provoking them, because the blood libel resonated with what was most important to people, to people's closest values, namely the church, the Catholic Church, the Orthodox Church, and clearly evoked themes of the Last Supper and perpetual Jewish betrayal in ways that would be very emotionally powerful. So that narrative is less emotionally powerful. So instead, like a classic blood libel, the Apartheid Lie is the inversion of the truth, carefully tailored to play on themes that are the most sensitive in whatever era it is made. Today, those are themes in the West of racial justice, racial discrimination. So you touch on those nerves, maybe you're gonna fail to convince a lot of people, but those who you will convince, you will powerfully provoke. And even those who you don't, you may emotionally disturb in a way that will create a permanently bad taste in their mouth about the Jewish state. So we see that this too has these two classic criteria of blood libels, simply adapted to the current day. I look forward to taking your questions in our future session.